welcome everybody here for our Sundays at the Cahoon series. We've been so fortunate to be able to feature some of the artists in our basketry, Interwoven basketry show that we have in the historic galleries. I just want to invite you all to also come next week. We have Arlene McGonigal, who does descriptive baskets. She'll be here. I also want to let you know that this talk will be recorded and on our YouTube channel. And Mikey, our Education and Programs Manager, has recorded all the other talks. So if you're interested as well. Super excited to have Elizabeth Whyte Schulze here. She's driven a couple of hours to get here, to come talk about her work. And when I saw her here with the Brenda Kingery pictures all around her, I thought I wanted to tell you that we scheduled the Brenda Kingery show first, and then I was tasked with coming up with a companion show for our historic house galleries in our Cahoon Contemporary series. And the first person I thought of as someone who interweaves their life with their work was Elizabeth. So she inspired really the whole basketry show. So, and then when I saw her work down here and saw her, it all started to make even more beautiful sense. So, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to, so you see the evolution. I didn't start painting on these baskets right away. It took a while to come to that. I came to Boston in the 1970s when what we termed then at that time a fiber revolution was happening. Many of the woolen mills were closing and going south, and left a lot of these mill buildings, those big ones that we all know about in our area, empty, except what was left inside, yarns and threads and fibers and all sorts of woven materials that were no longer being used. And a lot of the art students started saying, well, we could go up there, and they were selling them. It wasn't free, but you could go up there and come back with all sorts of different materials. And at the same time, too, people were encouraging people to make different types of weavings. At that time, a lot of times weaving was very, what I would call staid, flat. There wasn't really an idea about moving out into sculpture. There was some idea. In Europe, some people in Poland and Sheila Hicks working, even though she's an American, was working in France. People were start doing large sculptures, but they weren't shown with the fine arts. They weren't shown as sculptors. And then in the 70s, it started changing. People started appreciating fibers a little bit more, the interest in these materials, the whole concept of domestic materials, women making things that are important. At this time, I became interested, while they're doing weaving and different things, also basketry, crochet, lace, lots of different types of things that we think of using a fiber. And I learned about coiling, about basketry and fiber, and that was my interest totally, and I've just stayed with it. And coiling is I have a sample here. This is something that I've been working on. This is the materials that I use. And you start in the center, you stitch what they call a very short, small button, and then you build out. So every row has to be stitched to the row previous. So it sounds, time consuming, but the beautiful thing about coiling is that you can make it very tiny, very small, or you can keep adding more materials and it can grow. Each row could be much larger if you so desire. There's a real versatility to it. And it can be flat, it can be round, it can come up on the sides, it can be a big bowl. To me, it really had a lot of possibilities. In 1980, I was fortunate enough, my husband and I, to go to Nepal, Kathmandu, to visit a couple that we knew in the Boston area who had joined the Foreign Service, and they were given a big house and said, come, and we did. So this will begin to tell you a little bit about how travels really inspired me or interested me and became reflected in my work. When I was in Nepal, we would walk the streets or visiting different cities and places in the country, and the size and shape of the windows really interested me a great deal. And if you can see this piece, the windows I used in the coil, and here I'm using paper cording as the center of the core, and that's something core with basketry. You need a core, this coiled basketry, you need something that you're sewing over or attaching to, and you're using a material, and I use, and I'll have from this time to now, I'm using raffia, and you can dye raffia, I can paint on it. It's quite a versatile material, and this comes from a palm that they separate and open up in real natural material. But underneath here is a paper, just something you could get at a hardware store, and you can use any kind of material that could work in the center of the core. So when I was building, I came back from Nepal and used my sketches to develop the kind of baskets that I wanted to talk about what I saw in Nepal. I did a series, and over the years I've done series depending on the places that I traveled to. So this is called the Nepalese window baskets. I did a couple of them, and you can see at the center, I was talking about the center core is where you begin and then build up the surface stitching. There's different types of stitches. This one is one of the tightest stitch. It's called a crazy 8 stitch, so you have to loop around the row that you're adding and then go back down and make a stitch to the row previous, and then you stitch around the row above it and then stitch down. This is very, very tight and is quite time consuming, beautiful. But as I was developing my work, I really wanted to start making much larger pieces, and this seemed a pretty impossible thing to, or very time consuming for sure. So I developed or decided to start using long leaf pine needles. These are from the southern part of the United States. My husband's family had lived in Florida, so they were very kind to me and would gather them for me. You can, certain times of years, a lot of the pine needles fall down and people actually really dislike them because they're messy. But this was a great use for me, so they would rake them up and bring them to me. And I can do the same thing. I could use these as the core, and the beautiful part is I could use just one of them to start. When I said in the beginning, you use just you want a very tiny button that you're working with, and then you can build out. So then I could add, as I built up each row, one on top of the other, I could add more and more pine needles to them to build the basket that I wanted, the shape. And at this time, this is the 90s, I started building the designs. I was very interested in the American Southwest and the glyphs and markings that are left, called petroglyphs, on the stones, on the cave walls, on the, any parts that you're going to. Generally, there's lots of places. And it's not just, I mean, America, we have a lot of them here, but all over the world, if you research, many countries have petroglyphs and glyphs and markings in their cultures. And these people left and marked in them, they left all these very, very interesting designs. I should have said that in the beginning. We're going to have questions after I'm done, so please remember your question, and I'd love to answer. Thank you. So the glyphs and markings were something that I wanted to incorporate in my work, and at this time I started stitching using a embroidery floss, because it's a very sturdy, light it doesn't fade, generally, the embroidery floss, and I can stitch back and forth with that. And the same thing on the outside, when you're finishing off the basket, I use to go over the pine needles and stitch very closely in a way to finish off the piece. The natural design and building of the basket, I loved making the dark design on the light, but one thing that I didn't like about it, I didn't like the background. I didn't like what would happen. You know, when you're stitching back and forth like that, you've got to start somewhere, you've got to end somewhere, and it would be almost impossible to try to make it look beautiful on both sides. And so that led me to think, okay, now what can I do to so that I could be more versatile with the ideas that I have without doing it all stitching. So in 1996, I was fortunate enough to visit the real cave in France, the Lascaux cave. And at that time, as you know now, unfortunately, it's permanently closed because of some kind of microbe is eating the designs and the paint. But they've made several replicas, so you can see what it's like or the experience. But for me, I was very fortunate. The Ministry of Culture you could write to, and they gave you 1 day, and they were showing 5 people through the cave. You couldn't take anything with you, no, just yourself. No cameras, no nothing. Don't touch anything, you know, you walk through the cave and you had 30 minutes. And it was so nerve-wracking to go through, because I was so hoping that it would make a difference in my work when I came back, but I didn't know. But I did. I found that by being in the cave and in the Lascaux they're actually they have beautiful big bulls and horses that appear to be romping because of the fact that the cave is very craggy and has these mounds, and that's how they put like the horse's rump on part of it, and you really get this sense that it's moving. And so this was a life-changing idea for me when I came out of there. I said, if I could bring my baskets more to life by using possible paint or attaching to this craggy surface of my basketry, that would be so interesting to me. And so I came back and did some more research about Lascaux, and come to find out on many of the caves in the area where they're not painted, they also have markings, very similar to the petroglyphs and glyphs, very similar designs. So in these pieces, this is one from that period, the Lascaux piece, and you can see the horses and the bulls and the goats, or whatever animals they would have had at that time. The biggest piece from this series is in the Racine Art Museum, RAM. A collector gave it to that museum. So that's how painting got started. In the back part, you can see when I built the baskets, I started using with the pine needles at the ends of them. This is how they're attached to the tree. I call them nibs on the end. A lot of times I don't use them because I'm not interested in seeing the bulky part of it, but it is a design element you can use when you're building the basket, and you can make a design out of it. This is from 1999, but you can see I'm still using it today in this puka piece that you have some the paper did a piece on that. Somebody told me that recently. So this type of painting was on the surface of the basketry. And though I really enjoyed the transition for a number of years, the one thing that happens with paint is it tends to be soaking up the material, the raffia. And so you'd have to use a lot of paint to really make the idea come through the design. So I had been to Japan a couple of times, and I came back with the paper, and I decided to use some of the mochi, the mulberry paper, handmade paper, and you can use a gel medium, and I could attach it to the surface of the basketry, let it dry, and then it made the surface a little, it still retained the basket, but it was also something that made it much easier for me to, be able to paint tiny details, different designs, a much more finer element that I had been looking for. So you can see the progression of what was happening by visiting some of these countries. Something there sparks an idea, an image. Earlier on, I went to Argentina and did a piece came back, and it's quite a good sized piece. It almost looks sort of like a cave shape, but I was inspired by the Mapuche people there with a weaving book that I found, and they had some really beautiful black and white designs. So I was able to do some designing. This is where you stitch dark and light, and you can make a design like the glyph design. Inside I did a painting. I don't have a photo of this, but this is the one. You can look it up. It was acquired by the National Museums of Scotland because they have in their collection a Mapuche woven belt with these designs. And they have recently renovated their museum, and one part of the museum, they wanted to show that contemporary artists are being influenced by the kinds of materials that they have in their museum. And so and if you go on the museum's website, I have the websites for you to look at if you're interested to note, but they do a whole piece on my work, a very nice talk to let people know that this is so important, that that today's people are looking back at these countries, the things that were produced, the artwork and that type of thing. So I was really pleased to have a piece as a part of this in their permanent collection. Another thing I've been adding, and you'll see in these pieces, is I add other items to the piece that I'm working on. I might add a belt here with a piece of woven material. I might add a beaded necklace to the figure. I might add some discs for the hat to make it come alive. So there's many different things that I'm exploring to see how it would work in that fashion. In 2018, I went to Peru, and this is the piece that I developed from that. I don't want to go out of the video there. This is about the early people of Peru, and one group that I got interested is the Chancay, were a civilization that made three-dimensional figures that could stand up. They're out of ceramic, and I saw them in various parts in the country. The Chancay were a much earlier civilization, and now the archaeologists are researching and digging up a lot of these figures. And I love the shape of them, the hat that goes up like this and goes across, or it almost looks like their face as well. But some of them that are found in these, it's actually tombs that they're unearthing, and they find them all standing in, when they've opened them up, these different figures. And they're both male and female, often have a woven hat on their head. Because of the dry climate, things have lasted. Same with the cloths. If they put a woven skirt on the woman, they would last. I came back from that trip and started researching about the Chunkai, and that's why these images, this figure with what looks like to me a hat, often shows up around and continues, whether it's from another country. I often combine them together. This piece specifically is about, when I was visiting down there, I did read about the history, and unfortunately in Peru were taken over by the Spanish in those years, and they were not very nice to them, and a lot of the people perished, not only because of the diseases, but just because of how they were treated. And so for me, this piece is a ghost figure, and in the hands manipulating the small balls of representing the people that have been lost, and coming out here, you can see almost like the dots of the spirit going off. As you go around the piece up here, you'll notice that I did not use paper in this area, so I would use a little bit of paint, hand wiping the paint colors coming from the bottom area. The paper ends right about here. And so I'm painting on this area, but continuing some of it as I'm painting on the surface. There is a red line that's actually hand stitched with a dyed raffia, and that's stitching across the upper part, because I can actually stitch in here back and forth and be able to do this. So that's one of the things. I can't really stitch like that unless I have an opportunity. I do like to do the stitching, but it's not an easy element to add. Some of the glyph ideas are here. Glyphs, as well as, especially in Argentina, they have a huge cave that is known for the handprints that were left by peoples. I mean, this is done too, and you'll see them in other parts of the world, but the handprints in different colors all over the cave wall. So these are the elements that I've used to embellish and represent the Peruvian experience when I came back. Another year, I went to Egypt, and when I was thinking about, from my sketchbook, looking at the different things that interested me, lots of different images of people, and I started using, because in the marketplace you'll see women with all sorts of different dress, whether they're in the burqa or they're just in the regular dress, or they've got a chicken on their head. Lots of different ideas, and still using imagery from the glyphs or markings, as well as the Chunkai figure will still continue. Decided to use that as well. And experimenting a little bit with the Arabic language, and that's what this is, the curvature, the design of the Arabic words, just experimenting a little bit with that. So this is one of the few times that, like on this, the pine needles, I actually did use the paper and attached it on top of the pine needles. It's not so easy to do that, and I don't even know if I feel that successful about painting on the surface, but it was something that I decided to do on this piece and experiment with that. Another place, and I think it's in your wording, most of these pieces here were from my Morocco experience. When I came back, I'll speak about this piece here, Cora. The markings, actually where they come from, these designs were from the women in the Sahara, the Berber. Earlier on, it's not done too much today, used tattoos on their face and on their parts of their hands and upper parts of their arms. And when I came back, I researched a little bit about the designs, and so I decided to cover this main figure with these tattoo designs that I did some research about. They would have been on there. I've used it not only on the body, but on the whole surface. Morocco's known for these wonderful rugs, and all the rugs are woven by women from the smaller villages, and most of the rugs are then sold in the large marketplace along the coast, and the money goes back to them so they can keep up the tradition, and they really are very, very beautiful. Some of the rugs, they actually used and attached to them, they used these lovely, they call them sequins, but they were metal sequins that were attached to the rugs in various parts. And in the sun, the desert sun especially, they are brilliant. You know, the sun reflects, and they were something to use. Well, I couldn't find, our sequins are plastic or something. I didn't really like the look of that. But what I developed was using the metal washers that you can get in hardware stores. They're very fine, and also the red part here are the washer, or they use them in computers. These are paper washers, and they come in different colors of reds and a lot of rusts. So I've been experimenting with that, and some of the smaller, all the metal ones here. On the other side of this piece, I've always been very interested in women's issues and women's rights. And since the Women's March of 2017, I try to include a figure wearing the pink hat girl, and other iconic women, RBG. The cat woman is from Egypt because that was a famous little figurine in the Pharaoh's tomb. The rabbit ear girl is from when I was in Japan that one year. The fashion statement was for young girls to wear on their head little rabbit ear, and this was in the Tokyo, the downtown department stores. But you saw the young girls wearing them, dressed to the nines, and the bunny ears. So you'll see on all my pieces, I'm trying to include women from all walks of life, but my statement is to say that women, no matter where we come from, we need to support each other. It's really important, no matter who you are and what level. That's important. So this piece is called Puka, and this is the central, like the mother figure or some main figure, and her hat or headdress or hairdo is full of these very tiny, sparkly washers. On this side of her are the glyphs or the markings and the printings of the hand, and all kinds of small markings that tell that story. Here there's a whole parade of smaller figure women going around underneath, and she's holding a looping circle. If she's the mother figure, it could indicate life. It could be any number of things. On this side is a tattooed woman with the designs, and Morocco is famous for beautiful tiles that are used on the floor, on the ceilings, on the walls, and also in the marketplace. You'll see where the water fountains are beautifully tiled. And so when I came back, I wanted to try to replicate some of the ideas of the beautiful tiles that you would see in Morocco. And finally, this piece is on the wall upstairs, and I call this the blue fez, because the hat of Morocco, it's usually red, and I think it's only worn by men. It's a smaller hat, but I like this figure with the deep blue. And this is the center, the opening of the basket. So when I made the basket, you can go all the way out, and then I immediately turned around and started coming all the way back, and finished it off so it almost looks like it's the real, like his mouth, the mouth she's calling out to. It could be in the marketplace or in the small village. And here's another line of the small figures. I was interested in doing something about the rugs and the beautiful designs, because there's so many different ones. And this is one typical one you would see being sold. And here's I love the arches of that country, and the mosaics. And then again, I'm using it's very hard to see because it's white on white, but the designs from the tattoos underneath, and then white on top of white, not so easy to see, but it gives a very beautiful texture to the surface. So this is, so you can see that not everything, this is something I just finished the other day. I'm going to do a small endangered species series. I'm not quite sure, I'm developing that. But this is a little basket, bowl, jug, jar. And so I always start, I have an idea, so I know the size and the shape that I want to make and how I'm going to end it up here. And then I'll develop how I'm going to finish work on it, where I'm going to put the paper, how I'm going to add that, where the design element is going to go. And so these are, once again, the same materials and the raffia, but it's true. You start at the very beginning and then you build up. So the painting, that's how that happens. So thank you very much for coming. So if you have questions, you did. Yes.
Do you use your materials dry?
I wet them a little bit, but you really don't have to, because these pine needles are really, it's hard to understand if you haven't seen them before. Around here we have pine needles, but they're these very short things, and they're extremely brittle because of our culture.
Can you just show how it bends?
I'm sorry.
Can you just a little bit show how we can bend that, or will that?
Yeah, oh sure. So if you were doing it, I do wet it a little bit, but you can see how they're just very sturdy and supple. And it's very discouraging if, per se, you found something like that and you were going like this, and usually they would snap. Well, you can't, you know, because then you've broken the place that you're going to be coiling over, and it's very discouraging. But these are, and they can last for a really long time. And I'm lucky to, somebody I met at, that I was teaching a class to, volunteered to rake some up for me and send them to me. And I'm like, You can't really buy them, you know, it's too time consuming for somebody, you know, to put them together and then send them to you. So this woman was very generous in doing that. Yes.
When you use the pine needles and get to the end of the length, how do you overlap?
Okay.
Just keep going. And my next question is, in that flat one, the last one you showed us, you said you kept weaving around. Well, then you're weaving, so do you use the curved needle? And because
yes.
you're going into the hollow.
Yes.
It's hard to see where you're going to come up on the other
Exactly.
side because you're working on the inside.
Yeah, that's tricky. Yeah, this one is, you definitely, and you have to work with something very small, and that's delicate to bring that off. But
One other question is the paper. How do you attach the paper to that?
yeah.
Do you use glue or wax?
No, so you can buy today. They make a gel liquid medium that it's in the same nature of paints, and some people use it, mix it with paint, but you can just use it. You mix it with a little bit of water, and when you brush it onto the paper and onto the basket, it adheres itself. It's almost like this paper, because it's so fine, starts deteriorating or and attaches itself to the basket. Not everything does. Not every handmade paper. Some handmade paper is very thick. You have to find something. Sumi paper from Japan is very thin, and this mulberry paper. And usually you don't. I mean, I wouldn't just use one big piece and you don't wrap it like that. You need to you rip it so that you have an uneven edge, and then you can overlap them so that they work together. So when you're looking, you don't see the lines; they meld together. So the coiling is done like this. The question about stitching, you're wrapping the binder around, and to make, when you're running out here, you just take another piece and you fill it in. It goes right inside of, and that's the nice thing about pine needles, you just keep adding one or two at a time as you're going, and you fill out as it builds up the piece. And you can add, you don't usually add like a whole something this thick. You keep doing it one at a time, and it very evenly flows together.
So you take off the end.
I do, because I don't want it. If you wanted the design, then this is what's tricky, then you have to lay it on the outside and you're stitching it around. So the next time you come around, you don't want to stitch over that to cover it up because you left it as a design element. So it does get a little tricky in order for you to make your design, but if you pursue that, you can come up with a nice design. Yes?
I was wondering how you feel about covering up the beautiful coiling to start with. And I mean, I see that some of your shapes are very much what you might find in clay.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, like the one on my extreme left,
Yeah.
your right, that one, from here at least, I can't see any coiling except at the tip top, right?
Right.
So anyway, I'm just kind of curious.
How do I feel about it? Yeah, it was a difficult transition when you're a fiber maker working with those kinds of materials. Paint was not something you did. It was a hard transition, but I so wanted to have the versatility, as I tried to show with the stitching. I just was not that I just couldn't do what I wanted to do. And you could say, well, why don't you just use clay or something? But that's not my medium. I'm not comfortable with clay. I don't want to do that. I don't want to fire it. I love basketry, and by adding the paper, and also if you see, you can look inside the piece. You have the smell of fiber. So I'm sensitive to that for sure, and I, missed it, but I so wanted to do other things with it, so you guess
I
I
love
had to-
where the paint is without
This area.
the paper,
Mhm.
because you get some of both.
yeah. Touch. Without the gloves, sorry. Yeah, no, that's a very good question because believe me, it went through my mind. You spend all this time, and it's tough with paint. You're not erasing it, you're not undoing, you're not taking the stitches out. Nope, you can't do that. So it's there's been many a piece that I had to repaint the whole thing because it just wasn't working or what I'm doing. I will tell you that I've developed, this is only recently, a way of, like, for instance, these are hand stitched on the washers. So I actually am able to take like a little tiny X-Acto knife and cut out the shape that I'm doing it. Other times I tried to leave a space, but that's not always, doesn't always work out as I'm going around the piece. But this has allowed me then to create the design, and then if I find out where I want this hat to go, or maybe I didn't leave enough of a space, so I could do that, because here I do need the ability to stitch into the fiber surface. So I'm learning as I go. It's constantly working on that.
Will we be able to come up and look a little closer?
Absolutely, yes, I'd love you to do that. And you can ask questions up here. Should I put my mask on for people who are more comfortable?
Does anyone have any other questions?
When did you first start thinking about it?
So, as I said, I was in the 70s. I learned about the fiber and everything. And this first series, I've been working on it, but this was from Nepal, 1980.
So you were about 25 maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's a life. No, I mean, I love coiling. I will always be doing. People say, oh, it's so time consuming. But it's really a very comfort, and it's such I've been able to express myself so well with it, so great. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. What a treat. So do come up and look at the